나 피해. 행동하기. I avoid. going. I avoid. eating. I avoid. lying. I avoid. ringing. I avoid. singing. I avoid. springing. I avoid. swimming. I avoid. sinking. I avoid. drinking. I avoid. beginning. I avoid. rising. I avoid. seeing. I avoid. writing. I avoid. knowing. I avoid. giving. I avoid. taking. I avoid. shaking. I avoid. throwing. I avoid. blowing. I avoid. flying. I avoid. falling. I avoid. growing. I avoid. riding. I avoid. driving. I avoid. freezing. I avoid. bearing. I avoid. awaking. I avoid. wearing. I avoid. swearing. I avoid. speaking. I avoid. choosing. I avoid. stealing. I avoid. getting. I avoid. hiding. I avoid. beating. I avoid. tearing. I avoid. breaking. I avoid. saying. I avoid. telling. I avoid. hearing. I avoid. feeling. I avoid. weeping. I avoid. sleeping. I avoid. sitting. I avoid. standing. I avoid. winding. I avoid. finding. I avoid. thinking. I avoid. meaning. I avoid. bringing. I avoid. meeting. I avoid. fleeing. I avoid. catching. I avoid. holding. I avoid. fighting. I avoid. winning. I avoid. creeping. I avoid. binding. I avoid. hanging. I avoid. stinging. I avoid. swinging. I avoid. sticking. I avoid. feeding. I avoid. leaving. I avoid. leading. I avoid. buying. I avoid. having. I avoid. selling. I avoid. sending. I avoid. losing. I avoid. spending. I avoid. paying. I avoid. digging. I avoid. laying. I avoid. making. I avoid. bending. I avoid. building. I avoid. landing. I avoid. lighting. I avoid. burning. I avoid. spilling. I avoid. sweeping. I avoid. keeping. I avoid. running. I avoid. coming. I avoid. letting. I avoid. reading. I avoid. setting. I avoid. putting. I avoid. spreading. I avoid. hitting. I avoid. bursting. I avoid. casting. I avoid. cutting. I avoid. slitting. I avoid. splitting. I avoid. thrusting. I avoid. hurting. I avoid. shedding. I avoid. casting. I avoid. shutting. I avoid. sewing. I avoid. sewing. I avoid. swelling. I avoid. showing. I avoid. proving. 너 의지력이 참 강하구나.